All right. Thank you, Dean. Okay. What does it take to bring robotics and AI from the lab to the real world? Joining us to break down the process are the Engine General Partner, Milo Werner, academic commercial crossover specialist, Joyce Sidopoulos of MassRobotics, and Pieter Abbeel, who splits his time between UC Berkeley and AI company Covariant. Please welcome them and your moderator, Devin Coldway.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us here today. What I'd like to talk with you about today is the process of going from idea or proof of concept in robotics or AI to a product that you can scale and present confidently. This is kind of a big topic, so I figured we could start with something more concrete, the sort of technical side. So what are some of the challenges that you have seen teams or growing teams, scaling teams face over and over in this process? I feel like maybe Milo, you've got a kind of a bird's eye view on this. Could you start us off?
Yeah, for sure. There's probably two main pieces that teams face in going from kind of pre-production pilot build into mass production. And the first one really is adapting to the manufacturing environment. Your equipment isn't going to be as precise. It's not going to be as rigorously monitored. So just understanding how to adjust your process to be able to be precise in a less precise environment. I would say the second piece is all the cost down work you're going to have to do once you get into production. So a lot of people think, I've got my final end product here. Now we're going to go to manufacturing. The reality is you go through a series of iterations once you enter manufacturing for cost down, and managing the ramp up and those changes at the same time are super challenging.
I should guess so. Yeah, I would guess that manufacturing in general has to be a huge sticking point for hardware companies. Joyce, I know you may have some input on that. Do you have any strategies to suggest for doing this, making that transition without going back to the drawing board?
Yeah, so, well, a lot of times they do have to go back to the drawing board, but sometimes you'll have a prototype that's working, but you have wires going into two sides of a board, and so when the technologists are designing the product itself, they just want it to work, right? They want the thing that goes in, and they want you to give you something that's coming out, or they want to use sensors, compute, and then actuate. But when you actually go to manufacturing, the manufacturer will say, we can't put that board on top of that. We can't assemble it that way. So you really, from the beginning, should be thinking about manufacturing and design for manufacturing. So it's always good to get a manufacturer involved early in the process.
Gotcha. And Pieter, you're on the software side of things now. How does that change sort of the challenges that companies face, or startups or founders face in these early stages when they're changing phases?
Right. So when I think about the transition from where I tend to usually start myself, or a lot of people I know start, which is in a research lab, and you're just trying to get a prototype working, and often you can write a paper that gets a lot of visibility and excitement for showing something for the first time it can work. And then you go to something in production that you want to make work, and all of a sudden, it's not the fact that you can make it work once that matters, as Milo was alluding to earlier also, it's the consistency, having it essentially always work. And so chasing the very kind of high nines of performance and reliability, I think is probably the biggest difference in terms of what I've seen myself and others busy with in a research lab in the academic environment versus in an R&D environment for industrial productionization.
Gotcha. And in that changing phases from innovation to reliability and product market fit is sort of the next piece I wanted to talk about, the business side of things. And we can come back to the technical stuff too. But since you've mentioned this, do you find that that transition going into a more of a reliability mindset is difficult for people in academia, especially? Pieter, you can sort of maybe continue that thought.
Well, certainly when we started, particularly at Covariant, it was quite eye-opening that there is this completely different activity you get busy with, and I wouldn't say it's not research anymore. It still requires a lot of research and innovation, but it's a very different kind of research and innovation with a very different focus from what you're typically used to in academia. You're chasing the long tail of all the scenarios you haven't seen yet. How can you make sure that AI can handle all of them? Or how can you make sure that a combination of human and AI working together can effectively handle all of them? Because ultimately, it doesn't matter if it's AI just doing it alone or teamed up with a human. That's totally fine too, as long as it's effective, cost effective, and doing a really good job. And so that is a very big difference how you just think about the problem. And so yeah, that for us has been quite exciting and interesting. It's just a completely different way of working on R&D effectively.
Mm-hmm. Joyce, Milo, any follow-ups there?
Milo, this is what you were discussing earlier about going from an environment that's controlled to going to a new environment that's uncontrolled. And so really getting that reliability in an uncontrolled environment, right? Going from the lab and going from a test area to going out into the real world, you get a lot more variability, right? And unpredictability. So there's a lot of use cases and edge cases that you don't get in the lab, right?
Milo, you have a comment on that? She's just like, let me just put some words in your mouth there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it can be as simple as talking about adhesive if you're going to have a waterproof product. In the lab, the environment in the lab is very controlled. You're only using one batch of adhesive. You have very controlled temperature, humidity. So the viscosity of that adhesive is exactly the same every time you apply it. When you move to the factory, all of a sudden you don't have those temperature controls in place. You've got multiple batches. You don't know if one of the batches was exposed to high heat. And so all of a sudden the viscosity and the exact amount that you planned on measuring out to make that waterproof seal is all over the place. It's different. Mm-hmm. So that's just like a classic example that people face moving from the lab to the production environment.
And I feel like the mindset change that Pieter was talking about as well is something that founders and technical founders especially, I think of them as a type, although I couldn't really describe it to you, but there's definitely a sort of type, and I feel like they may find certain lessons more difficult than others. Have you found that there's any patterns, sort of lessons or challenges that are especially difficult for technical founders coming out of like such interesting institutions as yours?
Yeah. I mean, the wonderful thing about these founders is that they have spent the past, 4 to 8 years working on a vision that they're really passionate about. So they're absolutely fabulous storytellers. The part that they often face is that they need to build a big team, and that team needs to be just as strong or stronger than them. And so coming from the academic institutional space it can be a very individual contributor ideology, and moving to the business space is completely team oriented, and you are only as strong as your team. And so that's a big paradigm shift that sometimes takes a little while to settle in.
Any thoughts on that, Joyce, Pieter?
Yeah. I would totally agree with that. It's and the other thing is trying to find people with expertise that you don't have. So we find that a lot of times the co-founders are passionate about what they're doing, and they're doing it for a reason because they've encountered a challenge in the world that they feel they can fix, right? But then you really have to bring in a strong business focused person, because how do you sell this thing? How do you put it into a pitch deck? That's not what you're taught when you're in engineering school, right? You're taught the technical pieces. And so, I almost feel bad for founders who they have to learn everything. And so if they can find a good expert in business or a good expert in marketing that they can bring on the team who is as passionate as them, and that's always difficult too. It's finding the right people and the right combination. It's like getting married, right? You're marrying someone who you're going to be spending a lot of time with. And so you have to make sure that you have the same goals, you have the same mission, you have the same work ethic, because you don't want, you don't want people to get aggravated with each other. That person's not coming in on a weekend and I'm dedicating my life to this. So it's really important to pick the right people. That's really tough for the technical founders.
Mm-hmm. Pieter, has that been your experience?
I mean, all this resonates, and I can share a very specific story of what happened at Covariant on this front. When we started out, actually, our first lead investor, Amplify, had a partner who they made available 5 hours a week, who had a ton of operational experience on the sales, business development side, many previous startups, where he had worked full-time, but now he was a venture capitalist, and he brought all that operational experience into what we were doing. And we quickly found that 5 hours wasn't, we wanted more. We only got 5 hours as part of the package of being funded, but then we could hire him for more hours. And then over time, actually, we got him so excited to join us as our COO. And I think it's a great example of somebody who most likely would not have been in our natural network, but came our way in a way that actually it was possible to get to know each other very well for several months before we really started working full time together, but completely different set of experience and skill set and so valuable. It's amazing. When I think about the founder side of things, I would say that perhaps the most important thing is, and this is often the case, but I think it's important, is have a natural curiosity for everything. Like not just being curious about the technology, be curious about, what's the best way to talk with customers? What are their needs? What's the best way to do marketing? What's the best way to do pretty much anything the company has to do? Because when you're curious about that and excited, it's much easier to attract really good people that are experienced in that space.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I feel something you all already touched on, the knowing when to hire someone, a marketer, a CFO, a COO, or whatever. It's really not obvious especially to first-time founders, people straight out of grad school. They are working with their former roommates. It's stuff like that. Have you had to sort of infuse that kind of knowledge into them and say, like, look, here is when you need to hire a business person, because this is not a business. This is a couple of people working on a robot. Do you have to sort of drill that into people, or do you find that they sort of naturally discover that? It sounds like in Pieter's case, you had a sort of serendipitous relationship, and that's awesome. Everybody should be so lucky, but I feel that there's certainly many situations when that's not the case.
Yeah.
Any advice for when to sort of make that happen?
Yeah. I'll jump in a little bit. The engine hosts a program called Blueprint, which is basically something very similar to what we're talking about. It's a program for graduate students, postdocs, research scientists, faculty members, to really explore what it would look like to have these commercial opportunities. And as part of that program, we work with founders to help them understand, what they might need to do to mitigate technical risks or evaluate target markets, think about hiring, how to go about hiring, kind of all of those pieces. And so typically the philosophy I use is you want to hire in advance of when you actually need that skill set, right? So I think getting out there and meeting as many people as you can in as many different disciplines and being super curious about them and what they understand and know. Opportunistic hiring is a great way to think about it.
If you've got the money.
Go for it.
And so I think that's part of the problem, is that when these startups need the person, they don't have the funding. And so how do you find the person? What kind of deals can you make? Can you give them a little bit of equity? What will attract them? We started a peer group, a CEO peer group that meets monthly, and the CEOs help each other. Right, the ones that have gotten a little more advanced will help the newer ones and say, listen, you might want to think about bringing a marketing person in now, or do you hire a part-time marketing company? They're not as invested in you, right? So when is the right time to hire, and what should your next hire be? So it's nice that they hear it from each other. So rather than bringing in always experts, when they hear it from a peer, it's a little bit different. But yeah, a lot of times they don't know when to bring in the next person. right?
Another difficult lesson I feel is sort of may have to happen at this stage is deciding where to focus your resources in terms of business, in terms of your product market fit. Do you find it's better to sort of pick a use case early on and stick to it, or keep your mind open? What are the sort of paths that you can take here, and what have you found is best for moving forward as a small sort of technical founder, a small technical startup? Maybe Pieter, you've experienced this.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time trying to find the right use case for Covariant. When we founded Covariant, we knew that robot learning was capable of things that were not possible before. So there should be a range of use cases that are enabled by this, but what's the right one to take on first? Let's say, I mean, ideally, you can take on all of them in the long run, but first you need to find something where you land, and from there you can expand, of course. Actually, we met with about 200 companies in just 6 months time span, the first 6 months, just to understand if they got a robot in their facility, what would that robot be doing for them? And for us to gauge how realistic in the near term to deliver a robot that can do what they're asking for, but also to gauge things like, well, what if we deliver that robot to you tomorrow? Would you be excited about it, or would that not really fit with your plans and what you want? And so to us, that exercise was really valuable, because even though initially we started from robots that learn are going to have much wider capabilities than robots that are pre-programmed, from doing that exercise, we found that the warehousing space was a space where it was very clear that if you could deliver a robot today that does what people would want the robot to do, they'll be very excited to receive that robot and have the robot help out in everything that needs to be done in the warehouse. And so to us, that was very eye-opening, because many others were also very excited about robots, but it was excitement for, in some sense, the future of the company. It wasn't excitement for the today of the company. And so to us, that was really the big factor there in our decision-making. Who is excited for a robot today? And of course, can we also deliver on what they need that robot to do? And so we spent so much time in it. The first half year, almost for 2 out of the 4 founders spend 50+% of our time on just talking with companies to understand exactly what's the right place to start.
Interesting. Well, it is a great story, and that, I feel that experience will probably be very helpful to anybody watching this who is like, well, I need to find this fit too. So, what about Joyce or Milo? You have some input on that? Maybe a different take.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'll just call on both of you at once. All right, begin. Joyce, why don't you go ahead?
So I would say focus. So we get a lot of startups that have an awesome technology that can really solve a lot of problems, right? So the problem is you have to get one thing that works. And so if you're not focused on one solution for one industry, you're a lot of times spreading yourself too thin, and you'll never get to a good solution. So I feel that you should focus on one solution, get it working, get something out there that people are interested in, and you're solving a problem for somebody, right? What is the issue that you're solving? Make sure that there's a customer that actually wants that problem solved. We do a lot of these signature series where we'll focus on a certain vertical industry like construction. We bring the experts in here and they'll say, this is what our challenge is, the construction companies. And our startups will say, wow, that's a super easy problem to solve. We were solving this one. And they're like, we don't need that solved. So you have to really know what your customer, what their challenge is, and what they want solved and what they're willing to pay for. Get that, focus on one, get it accomplished. Then you have a story. Then you have someone who's using your technology. Then pivot to another case. But really, I feel that a lot of times, these technologies they can really solve a lot of problems, a lot of challenges, and really focusing on one first, getting one solved the right way is really helps with investment as well.
Gotcha. Your turn, Milo.
Yeah. It's a great point. I think the way I like to think of it as a platform. So think about your technology as a platform that could apply to a wide variety of businesses. I like to start at the beginning, solve the easiest challenge with a partner, right? So you're kind of using your partner to de-risk your technology. Once you've de-risked that technology, build on that and go farther. So an example that we had at Tesla was Tesla partnered with Toyota to build the RAV4 battery pack before they built Model S. Essentially, the Model S battery pack is built on the RAV4 platform, right? So Toyota paid Tesla to develop this battery pack, and Tesla used that money to build the platform by which the Model S battery pack was on, right? And then as we went down farther, we evolved different parts of the car, leveraging these partnerships.
I guess that brings up a new potential problem, though, which is the question of maintaining your independence and equity when you partner early, or if you take investment early and guidance early. I feel like you run the risk of potentially losing that independence that early founders are, I'm sure, they feel very strongly about their vision for a company, and then they're like, okay, we'll partner with Bosch, and Bosch will help us out, and then suddenly you're working on Bosch stuff, and Bosch people are telling what to do. How do you avoid that situation, though? Milo, maybe you can, since you recommend this, maybe you have sort of a way to avoid that nightmare scenario.
Yeah. It is certainly, you don't want to build a product for a large strategic, right? It's going to take you nowhere. I think you just have to really stay rooted in the platform and thinking about your long-term goals, right? Like, what is the long-term goal for the company? What are you going to be providing, right? And Tesla's vision is very clear, right? They're providing vehicles, low-cost electric vehicles.
Well, let me ask this then. In a more general sense, maybe, and Joyce, maybe you can speak to this. How do you think a company should balance its equity and independence when you have these early partnerships, like when you're focusing, when you're partnering, when you're taking investment? How do you think a company should maintain its independence?
So that's really a very personal thing, right? It's very up to the founders. What's their exit strategy? So if they're more interested in getting a technology off the ground and then selling and then starting something new, and that's their mojo, right? Then it's okay to lose a lot of equity early on, right? Or is it something that they want to build and continue building a company around this particular platform, right? Then you don't want to give it up. So it really depends on the personal preference of the founders. But it is a balance, because you need the income and you need the support of the partner. So you have to really balance how much of your company are you willing to give up.
Yeah, and Pieter, I imagine you can speak to this, having experienced it yourself and probably taken part in several of this process.
Right. So there's a couple of things here. One thing that we always paid a lot of attention to was, are we learning from this partnership, right? Are we learning new lessons? Are we learning something general that we can imagine applies to a wide range of customers in the future? And so I think that's a pretty good metric, because in some sense, the reason you want to be deploying as quickly as possible is to learn the deployment lessons. And you find an early adopter who wants to right away try your technology. But then you really want them to truly try it. And I think that's another part that's maybe a bit more of a kind of a trap to easily fall into is a lot of the bigger companies, they have separate innovation centers. And the purpose of these innovation centers is obviously to bring in new technology, but there's often a very big hurdle to make it from the innovation center activity to the actual production activity. And so you really want to understand that part also. You don't want to be an innovation center kind of purgatory for if you can actually be in production. But it can be tempting, because you're like, oh, we're working with this big brand, logo that we can put up now because we're working with them. But you might not be learning the real lessons from that would be needed to put things into production. You might be working towards a showcase. And so I think that's a pretty important distinction to really think hard about when partnering with companies. Are you partnering with a production person? Or are you partnering with an innovation person? Doesn't mean innovation is always wrong. It can be the right thing at times, but you really need that path, a clear path to production. Otherwise, it is probably wrong.
Gotcha. And I think a similar thing may be, speaking of purgatory, sort of university tech transfer offices and that sort of, I'm mindful that we all have academic associations here. I don't want anybody to have to slander their institution, but I've heard mixed reviews of the role that universities have for, burgeoning startups and, when it's been developed in a lab, in a using university resources. I think that's very common in this sector. Do you have any tips for navigating that? Obviously, Milo, you're sort of in this position, sort of in a related position, but the engine is very different, obviously. Do you have any tips for navigating the sort of escaping the university orbit?
Yeah, I mean, the university orbit has a lot to offer. At the same time, you're right, you have to move beyond that. And I think just getting out on your own, getting to an incubation space is just incredibly important, and bringing people in from outside the university to build your startup.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, Peter, go ahead, Joyce.
I was going to say that's one of the impetuses for MassRobotics, actually. We were meeting as a robotics cluster, and everyone was talking about what happens to students when they have a great invention and want to start a startup. They leave the university, they don't have access to the machines anymore. They don't have access to the prototyping. They don't have access to their network. And so that's one of the things we built, the engine has, right? All of the facilities and the tools that are very expensive for startups that they need to prototype, especially in the hardware space, right? You need a CNC machine. No one's going to go out and buy a $40,000, $50,000 CNC machine. If they have access to it at the university, it's almost like that will make them stay. So, spaces like, the engine and MassRobotics are places for these kind of companies to go and get the resources that they need that they were used to at the universities.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. And Peter, I'm sure you've had to sort of walk this line yourself. Any tips?
So my experience is, of course, specifically with Berkeley, and the experience has actually been very, very smooth. And I think there's a few paths that are very well supported. One path is where you decide that what you build at the university is great. It shows that you're in some sense ahead because you display your work at conference and it gives you that credibility to be ahead. But you also realize that what you built there is not what's going to be your company. It just puts you in a great, credible position, and now you can start building your company. And so you have a very clean transition because you're saying, okay, everything I did at university, that's public. Everybody can access that, but I now already have ideas for what to do next. And then, in fact, I'm going to talk with customers, and that's going to further inspire what I'm going to do next. And that way, it's a very easy transition. Now, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you build something you decide you want to keep private. And in my experience, Berkeley can license things relatively quickly. If you want to keep some things you develop private rather than open source it and build upon it. And the other thing that I haven't personally taken advantage of yet, but that's been interesting, I've seen other people do, is you can actually now use some university space if you want to start your company. You need to do some kind of negotiation. There's obviously, there might be some equity exchange and so forth, or some rent to be paid to do so. But that allows you to continue to have access to some of the lab equipment in exchange for something you put in place contractually that the university also gets something out of it. And I've been pretty impressed with the kind of range of things that Berkeley is open to engaging in to make this a mutual success.
Right. Yeah. And I think that they have been getting better, and there's more resources if you look for it, it sounds like. So we only have a couple minutes left here, but I want to touch on something that you all have individually sort of lightly touched on already. There's this hazier concept of having a story for your startup. Not like necessarily just like, oh, me and my roommate both really like brushless motors, so we started a brushless motor company. It's like, that's not a very interesting story, but it's hard to tell what is an important story to tell. It's about just showing why your company exists beyond making money. And that's something that you need to tell investors, and it's something you need to tell potential employees and stuff like that. I'd just like to hear briefly from each one of you how you think how to best tell that story, whether it's how you've done it yourself or how you think someone else should. Why don't we let's start with Joyce.
Yeah, so I always find that the companies that are successful have a personal story and a personal reason for starting the company. And one of our companies, the founder, his mom had ALS, and he was looking for a way for her to communicate, and so built something that he could wear on his wrist that would detect impulses that could help her type. Another one was living in a small space, and he said, how can I make more uses of the space that I live in? Another one was working on inspecting tanks, oil tanks. And he said, he used to have to suit up every time he went into the tank. And it's very dangerous. And he said, there's got to be a better way for someone to do these tanks. So when he starts his pitch, he shows a picture of him in the suit going into a tank and what it used to take. And so his company is solving that problem. And I really think like it's very impactful seeing the founders tell the reason why they started the company, and then showing a commercial application. So their heart is in it. And it really, to me, that really helps make the sale to investors and to customers, right? They're really invested.
Gotcha. Peter, any brief remarks on that?
Yeah, so here's maybe one way to go about it process-wise. I think a lot of people have a new technology that they're capable of building. Nobody else at that time is capable of building, right? And then there's they find a clear use case. But I think then to get to what Joyce was talking about, what you're talking about, essentially this kind of bigger picture, I think it's a really good exercise to think about the asymptotics. Okay, we have this technology that's more capable that can do now this use case. What if we think about if we can really build this out in the long run, what would the effect be on the world? And so, for example, at Covariant, when we did this exercise, okay, we can build robots that learn, and they can learn interesting things today, even more interesting things in the future, we anticipate, right? So what does that mean? And we go through the exercise. Essentially, our conclusion is that effectively physical goods are very expensive right now because of manufacturing cost, actually mining cost or recycling cost, manufacturing, distribution. Digital goods are almost free. You just kind of zip through your Ethernet cable or phone, whatever, you get the digital good. And so the asymptotics in our mind for more capable robotics is that digital goods and physical goods, essentially, they should both be really easy to get and quite cheap. And so for physical goods, for that to happen, the robots are going to have to help out to get us there. And so that's kind of the mission, is make the physical as accessible as the digital.
Gotcha. And I know we're desperately over time, but Milo, if you want to throw something in there.
Yeah. I agree with both points. First bringing a personal story to it, and second, thinking how it impacts the world in the big picture. Kind of the framework that I like to use is thinking about describing what reality is today, and then oscillating between what it will be in the future, and then coming back and saying, what are you working on today and how will that change the future, right? And then coming back and forth. And that oscillation is really a strategy used by a lot of motivational speakers as you start to look at kind of the framework by which those speeches are made up.
Gotcha. Well, thank you very much. Very helpful. And I hope it was helpful to our viewers. And thank you all very much for joining us today. It's been an extremely interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Devin, for hosting.